Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here on this Saturday morning for this very important discussion at Radical Book Fair 2023. I'm Jim Taylor, he, him, and I'm the manager of Lighthouse Books. The issue of no platforming is an ever-present one for progressive social movements. Whose voices should we elevate and engage with in our public spaces, private venues, and various institutions? How and why are certain issues given legitimacy, whilst others are undermined, marginalised, and stigmatised? And by what moral metric should we determine the limits imposed upon freedom of speech? In our talk this morning, we're aiming to bring some nuance, complexity, and insight on issues around no platforming, free speech, and hate speech, challenge reductive narratives around censorship, and consider the power dynamics at play in the movements, institutions, and societies of which we are a part. Joining us for this important discussion are Dr. Hil Aked, a writer, investigative researcher, and an activist with a background in political sociology whose work has appeared in The Guardian, Independent, Sky News, and Al Jazeera, as well as volumes from Pluto Press and Z Books. Their first book, Friends of Israel, The Backlash Against Palestine Solidarity, was published by Verso earlier this year. And Dr. Gina Gwenffrewi, a lecturer in trans studies at the University of Edinburgh and LGBTQ+ rep on the UCU's National Standing Committee. Her published articles include J.K. Rowling and the Echo Chamber of Secrets and The Stoning of Stonewall During New Trans Panic. And her first book is due to be published by Ohio State University Press soon. Please join me in welcoming our speakers this morning. Just a note on format, we're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves. Sorry, I don't remember microphone technique. We're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves and then put it out to audience questions, so get your thinking hats on. I am aware that certainly a number of us, and I'm sure many of you, are planning to attend the demonstration on Waverley Bridge at 12 o'clock. So we are going to finish this event sharp, bang on 12 if not slightly before, so that people can head along there. Palestine Action do have a stall today here at the back by the bar, if you'd like any further information. Okay, so straight into it. This is a huge topic. We've just been talking about what a huge topic it is, and so we're just try and cover certain points as well as we can. What function would you say is served by no platforming, and is it an effective tool for progressive movements to use? Hil.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for having me. Nice to speak with Gina. But before I sort of answer the question, I just want to state the obvious, that I'm speaking about kind of tangentially, but about Palestine at a time when Israel's perpetrating a genocide with the full support of the British government. I know that Hamza Saeed and the Welsh Senate yesterday called for a ceasefire, so it's kind of less complicity here, but I guess I just want to just ground the discussion, like we were talking about how like topics of freedom of speech can sometimes be very abstract and academic, and obviously I think we would probably all agree that like in the end it has very material and tangible consequences. In the case of Gaza, you know, like bombs dropping on people and killing thousands. So it feels quite heavy anyway speaking today. But yeah, in relation to the question of the function of no platforming in progressive movements, I guess for me, it's kind of about drawing a line somewhere and saying which ideas we do and don't find acceptable and grant legitimacy to. You know, the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, which was launched by Palestinians in 2005, has been saying for a long time that representatives of the Israeli state or apologists for Israeli apartheid and genocide should not be given a platform. I think we're going to talk a bit later about the difference between, the nuanced difference between platforms and free speech. So, and I'm scared I'm going to say the same answer to all the questions, so I won't for too long. But I'll just say, I think it's definitely an effective tool for the right wing. They've been trying and succeeding for quite a long time to no platform or to censor, actually, Palestinians and their allies as extremists and whatnot. So I think personally it is an important tool. Yeah. What about you, Gina?
I think it's really complex because I'm split in two, like I'm sure a lot of activists. So with trans rights, which is my area, and which I've been sucked into in the last year, especially I think at Edinburgh University, this question of, do you make a big thing of an event, for example, an anti-trans event, for example, organized by a handful of bigots who are probably not going to get many people? Do you make this big statement where the media will come, and it's almost like it serves their interests to some degree? And there is that dilemma that activists have to confront. And I read recently, the Southern Poverty Law Center in the US, which is this human rights organization, and they give advice on don't protest, don't go outside the building where, for example, if they have a Milo Yiannopoulos or a Richard Spencer, some kind of alt-right figure, don't turn up because that's kind of what they want, but instead organize your own alternative events, which are much more affirming and so forth. So that's one side. And in the USA, especially, they have this big emphasis on free speech. So they're going to be protected anyway, people like Milo Yiannopoulos, these kind of outrageous alt-right people. So maybe that's the situation in the US. However, on the other hand, as Hil said very, very succinctly, it's about where do you draw the line. It's almost also like you're driven by rage and helplessness in these protests anyway. You don't have the media on your side. You don't have much power. This is a way of saying, no, you shouldn't be doing this at our establishment, for example. And in terms of, does it work? Sometimes it takes a long time to realize if it works or not. And the example I would turn to, I was reading recently about 1915 and Birth of a Nation, this extremely racist historical film that was created, I think, by D.W. Griffiths. And it's like a caricature of black and brown people as bestial, and portrays them as this is how history was. And the media supported this film. The film screenings, they were very popular in the US, and they were very popular in Britain, and there were protests. And you wonder, they were very unsuccessful at the beginning of the protests. They stood outside the screenings that do not show this film, and the films were shown. But the protests kept happening, sometimes in very inspiring coalitional ways, where the black and brown communities combined with the Catholic and Jewish communities, for example, up in Boston, because they were all targets of the KKK and the kind of white Protestant conception of the US. And over time, over decades, by the 1930s, they really stopped showing these screenings in the US, certainly in the way that they used to. This kind of shaming quality to protest and to no platforming, I guess, wore down the cinema proprietors. And over time, it worked. Sometimes it takes decades of these protests. It is very tiring, it is exhausting, but people don't want to be shamed in the same way. People, maybe the hardcore people will turn up for these events, for example, but others who are thinking, should I go or not? But no, they have to pass a load of protesters who are very angry and upset. Maybe they'll think twice. So I think on the balance of things, and thinking about Edinburgh University and the recent anti-trans events that have been happening, I think about 1915. I think about the protests that took decades, but I think ultimately trying to shame bigots or even people who are potentially on the cusp of entering this community of bigotry, creating a kind of shaming mechanism where people don't go into those spaces is worth doing. And Britain isn't the US. Maybe I would talk differently if it was the US, with the freedom of speech emphasis much more. That's something we can talk about later, about the different concepts of free speech. But I think it is an effective mechanism, but you can't always tell until decades down the line just how successful it was.
Thanks for that. You mentioned briefly there the kind of right-wing response to no platforming, and there is a tendency for instances of no platforming to be characterized as cancellation or censorship by the subjects of it. Is there a meaningful difference between no platforming and censorship, and does it matter if there is? Hil?
Yeah, I think that there is. For me, it's about power and power inequalities. So, as Gina mentioned, no platforming relies on having a platform in the first place, which an institution can choose to give or not give, and people within that institution, like take the example of a university, whether it's a transphobic speaker or a Zionist speaker, you might get the institution deciding to give a platform, but students protesting that decision. And so there's different power differentials there. Censorship for me is about top-down power preventing people from speaking. So, a classic example at the moment, I suppose, would be the prevent policy, where, or even, you could take the Suella Braverman trying to pressure the cops. I mean, we're living in a country where the Metropolitan Police are marginally less fascist than the government. She tried to pressure the police to ban the big pro-Palestine demo in London today on the grounds that it's armistice. So that would be for me a form of attempted censorship that's coming from the top.
My understanding is the prevent definition now includes left-wing and anarchist as terrorist organizations, I believe.
Yeah, and certainly as extremist organizations, and it's which is so vague and highly politicized as to be malleable and useful. And of course, boycott is kind of like a weapon of the weak. So, I think it historically comes from Ireland originally, where people were trying to influence kind of dodgy landlords, and now this is a tool that Palestinians use to try to reset the power balance and the asymmetries of Israel and the Palestinians' power as colonizer and colonized are reflected in the way that who has a platform and who needs to try to boycott, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Coming at this from a different angle, again with a specific example, because you mentioned the word censure and censoring. So I was recently involved in a protest. There was a book launch at Edinburgh University. There was a book called Sex, Gender, a Contemporary Reader. It was arguably the first gender-critical collection of essays, basically invalidating trans identity. It was an academic text, which makes the protest a little bit more difficult to justify at a university. We did protest it. The problem isn't so much the book. Even with the film, Birth of a Nation, 1915, let people watch that film for sure, but it depends on the situation, on the spectacle of it, if it gets turned into some kind of affirming spectacle, which can in turn result in a recruitment ground, or it can just be this kind of normalization of bigotry. So my position in terms of supporting UCU and also the Staff Pride Network at Edinburgh University wasn't that we should just censor this book, because I study anti-trans ideologies. I've read the book. It's very useful to read it to understand what gender critics are saying at a theoretical level. But turning it into a spectacle is something else. So that's why I wanted to protest the book and boycott the actual event of launching it, because of the way it was launched as this kind of debate opportunity, once again, which I thought was not fair to have that at Edinburgh University with a trans community that is beleaguered and constantly, 6 years of just media harassment and the public increasingly turning against trans people, as recent surveys have shown. So it depends what you're doing. Censure, I would be very careful of book banning, and interestingly, most book banning happens from the right. I read, again, it was 1,000, 2,000 books were they tried to ban about 2,000 books in 2022. One of them I know was Juno Dawson's This Book is Gay. So LGBT books, the campaigns usually come from the right with the censure of books, for example. They don't talk about this. It's a very selective process from the right, this thing about freedom of speech, which we can get into later. But I don't necessarily believe in censure of books. I don't believe in the censure of that particular gender-critical book. I don't believe in the censure of a film like Birth of a Nation, but it needs to have the right critical context if people are going to study it or have it at university. You can't just do this big context-free, almost, event, which actually there is something behind it, which is trying to promote a set of invalidating ideas. So it really depends. So I'm not for banning texts. I just think that they especially if their role is to invalidate vulnerable minorities, there needs to be a critical context, and it needs to be held in the right way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think context is really key. There is, this notion, so our modern understanding of free speech is arguably rooted in liberal theory, and that has a tendency to figure the public sphere as this kind of neutral marketplace of ideas, which is a somewhat loaded term these days, for good reason, where you present concepts and ideas, and if they're hateful or illogical, they will of course just be debated away. But this doesn't seem to really line up with reality. Is it fair to say that the public sphere is not, in fact, a level playing field? Gina, I've got you first this time.
Sure. Okay, first thing to say, though, is what is liberal ideology? Liberalism can involve freedom for individuals, and if you're going to have a society where people are free, you have to make sure also that they're living in a climate which is not filled with hate and violence and threats towards them. So, and I think a lot of liberals would agree with that. Liberalism doesn't mean a society without rules, kind of like a jungle or some kind of Mad Max dystopia. To have like a proper liberal democracy, I think there's a recognition that there are going to be some rules to stop some people's freedoms from infringing on the rights of others. Okay, but this thing that you've talked about, the marketplace of free ideas, okay. This isn't necessarily liberalism. This is neoliberalism in a very theoretical sense, and in a very hypocritical sense. The people who are pushing this kind of free marketplace of ideas, for example, and free speech more generally, they're not pushing for rolling back defamation laws, which are also curtailments on free speech, like slander and libel, and these types of rights tend to be used by the rich and powerful. So there are all kinds of rules that are not being challenged. This free marketplace of ideas, though, that you've talked about in terms of level playing fields, obviously not, right? We live, even I think conservatives would admit, society is inherently unequal. Inherently, they would say it's unequal, but the difference is conservatives might say, just deal with it. It's always going to be unequal because some people are talented, some people aren't, et cetera, whereas people on the left might say, we can deal with equality, but there needs to be structural changes. So there's always an acknowledgement that wealth and power consolidates itself. Rich people become richer, asset inflation, buying property, interest on their wealth, passing wealth on to their next generations. There's I think even conservatives, most conservatives would recognize, I've heard Jordan Peterson even say, he recognizes the need for some degree of redistributive taxes. And this is with free speech as well. I mean, you've got a media that is owned by billionaires and that enforces the agendas of billionaires, often not even in Britain, but even if they were, it would be agendas which do not want to talk about certain topics, whether it's the housing crisis or the cost of living crisis. So it's always unequal. Free speech is not a level playing field. It is already putting vulnerable people at a disadvantage, and that's why we need to kind of balance that out in protections and ways of redistributing free speech and those opportunities to do so. So Yeah, the free speech thing is, first of all, hypocritical. I don't think most people, like Ben Shapiro is always quoting it, I don't see him talking about getting rid of libel laws or slander laws or other curtailments of free speech. It's usually about the right to attack marginalized people or say whatever you want about marginalized groups. And that's where this hypocrisy needs to be addressed. It's never been a free marketplace of ideas in terms of if you expose ideas to rigorous debate, the best ideas will come to the top and the bad ones will fall. I mean, history is full of bad ideas getting to the top. Look at us now where, there's a genocide happening and the entire media class, the legacy media class and political class of the two main parties are refusing to get involved and say that there should be a ceasefire. So Iraq, 20 years ago, was it? 10 years ago? 20 years ago? So, yeah, it was 20 years ago. Oh my God, I'm so old. So again, history is full of bad ideas that got up to the top because of the way power and wealth is concentrated. And it is those people controlling that, their ideas tend to dominate. So, yeah, I don't agree that there is a free marketplace of ideas, and I don't think most people even would admit it. If you really push them.
Hil.
I mean, I basically agree with what Gina said. I was going to say the exact same thing. The history shows us it's bollocks. But I think the way it's phrased, this idea of a marketplace of ideas, as you said, points to the kind of neoliberal grounding of that kind of myth. And I can maybe give a couple of examples in the case of Palestine. The IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, definition of anti-Semitism, many of you will probably have heard of it. It's been very controversial because of the kind of 11 attached examples, some of which attempt to conflate criticism of Israel, criticism of Zionism, or support for Palestinian rights, essentially, with anti-Semitism. And it's essentially being used as a censorship tool to prevent Palestinians and their allies from speaking. And what's important about it in terms of the kind of marketplace of ideas is that it's been actually just forcefully and from the top down, coercively pushed onto universities. Like Gavin Williamson, when he was Education Secretary, said explicitly we're going to defund universities if they don't adopt this. But I think one of the things about liberal theory is it puts all this emphasis on freedom from, so the state can't restrict me, and I don't want to be censored, which is great, fine, but it's also about freedom too, and so we get back to the power and wealth that Gina was talking about. So in the chapter of my book on universities, I talk not just about the censorship of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices that goes on in universities through the IHRR, through prevent policy and other means, but also to prevent people from speaking, but also people's freedom to speak, whose voices are we hearing? And I look at the way that the subject of Israel studies has been promoted in US and specifically here in British universities by private funders who are taking advantage of the fact that universities, increasingly privatized universities, are very reliant on private donors. And all the funders who've supported Israel studies are closely connected to the Zionist movement, and some of them have said explicitly this is a way to fight anti-Zionism on campus. They often target universities like SOAS, Manchester, which are deemed to be hubs of pro-Palestinian left-wing activism, to promote Israel studies. Now, I don't actually think promotion of the Israel studies as a subject, although it is framed in a way that privileges Jewish identity in historic Palestine and marginalizes and invisibilizes Palestinians as indigenous people's claims and existence on that land. Despite that, I don't think it necessarily works I don't think it is working to fight BDS or hide the reality of Israeli apartheid. But they have successfully changed the contours of the academic landscape by establishing chairs of Israel studies, courses of Israel studies, and thereby making those ideas have more circulation and more prominence in society. So I think we need to look at that side of the coin as well.
Can I just come in as well? Just thought of some examples that also undermine this idea that we live in a free marketplace of ideas. When it turns to Elon Musk and Twitter, because literally last Thursday, the Trevor Project, which is a suicide prevention organization for LGBT youth, they've had to withdraw from Twitter. They made a statement last Thursday saying we can't operate on this increasingly unmediated public forum anymore. The amount of harassment and hatred has just undermined the entire purpose of what we're trying to do. 1 month previous to that, Mermaids, the trans charity, also made a public statement withdrawing from Twitter in terms of posting. So you see these marginalized groups being pushed to the margins in a public forum, the less regulated that it becomes. And that is what tends to happen. There's a theorist, Nancy Fraser, who talked about the idea of subaltern counterpublics. Minorities are forced to make their own kind of ecosystems of media and of consciousness raising and of activism, because usually historically the mainstream has been such a forbidding and threatening place, and a place that also portrays people in such delegitimizing ways. So, and certainly we have a trans counterpublic. We have places like Novara Media, which I go to for the news. I stopped subscribing to The Guardian years ago, just so dismayed by the level of transphobia by this nominally left-wing but mainstream newspaper. So we find new places online to go to because of the framing is so hostile to minorities. And because the framing is so hostile, anytime you even engage with those kinds of shows or coverage, it is always going to put you on the back foot. Trans people need to kind of apologize or explain for some single event that's happened, maybe I don't know, like a trans woman who's committed some kind of atrocity. And of course you can think immediately about Palestine. Anytime someone, a Palestinian or someone in support of Palestinian rights goes on the news, the very first question, we all know what it's going to be, right? It's going to be, do you condemn Hamas? So the framing is always putting minorities on the back foot. So these are structurally hostile environments in the mainstream. If you were going to have like a news program that genuinely dealt with trans issues, the first issue would be the appalling conditions of trans healthcare. Then it would be the appalling condition of media coverage. And it would also be things like hate crime. It wouldn't be, does a woman have a penis? Or these other quasi-philosophical, kind of pointless discussions that trans people have to get dragged into, but they are always the discussions that are thrown at trans people when they enter this free marketplace of ideas. So the framing by itself means that it's not really balanced or neutral or equal. It's always seems to be set against minorities based on prejudice. So I just wanted, just to kind of add that, because we have seen marginalized groups and charities withdraw simply when regulations get removed.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And there's a problem here, which I guess keys into the power dynamics we've touched on, which is that increasingly in today, what we consider the public sphere, as more and more of us are living online, is privately owned, which throws up a whole other raft of issues for speech and platforming. Just keep an eye on the time. We mentioned academic freedom a couple of times. Gina, could you speak a little bit to how issues of no platforming intersect with the idea of academic freedom, particularly in light of recent activities by transphobic pressure groups on UK campuses? Yeah,
and it's difficult because the example I gave, so sometimes there are really clear-cut examples where you say something shouldn't be on campus. And the example I'll give there, December 2022, some anti-trans activists who work at Edinburgh University organized a film screening for a film called Adult Human Female. It's a film that depicts trans women as, trigger warning, violent, delusional perverts. It does so with a lot of mockery. To give you some examples, there's one point where their resident gender-critical philosopher, Jane Clare Jones, talks about how there are more men who have sexual fetishes than actual trans women, and with the obvious inference that if you see a trans woman, it's more likely to be a fetishist. And while she's talking, they have this actor, topless, maybe naked, with women's gloves, getting turned on while putting the gloves on. And this is their supporting evidence for really putting this image in people's heads. Trans women are these just fetishistic men. There's another moment, again with Jane Clare Jones, talking about the delusion of trans identity. And while she's talking, they have this image of a wizard standing by the seaside, I think, just to kind of mock trans identity as something ridiculous and fantastical. There's another image of just this militia in black bloc with rainbow-colored sunglasses marching intimidatingly towards the camera. Again, it's just their actors, but just to really create this sense of fear in audience members about how threatening and menacing trans people and LGBT people are. And so the film goes on like this. It wasn't an academic film, and we said, you can't show this in an academic environment. It's just hearsay, it's just opinions, it's just prejudice, it's mockery. There's very little research in it. And we thought we were on good ground. Obviously we weren't, because the senior management of Edinburgh University are not interested in supporting minorities on campus and the dignity and respect policies that they put up in the first place. They've subordinated that to free speech fundamentalism. But then with the example of the book, the academic book, you then ask yourself, as a protester, should we allow this? Because in terms of academic freedom, it's published by Routledge. But still, maybe some things are bigger than academic freedom even as well. Dignity, human rights, the welfare of people to feel safe on campus as well. So there are those issues as well. The academic freedom issue also, though, has just exploded into life very recently because of what's been happening in Gaza. So in that case, things have become very menacing for academics. There has been a targeting. I don't know if anybody knows about what happened with the UKRI. So just very briefly, I can tell you, Conservative Minister Michelle Donnellan noticed that there were some UCU academics, so academics who are part of a UCU research body, UK Research and Innovation, and demanded that they be fired or suspended. And so the body suspended them on request, and this really frightened academia in terms of the fact that you couldn't actually just make public statements on, for example, Twitter in support of Palestinians without losing your job. This happened, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago. So now UCU has called on its members to withdraw from the UKRI completely. But we see the power of the government now to try and silence free speech on the situation in Israel and in Gaza and the West Bank. So it's a really complex area. Academic freedom can be utilized by people who are seeking to delegitimize minorities. And then I think it's valid to kind of try and challenge, maybe not the text itself through censure, but certainly the way that it is distributed and disseminated, for example, via the events. But on the other side, there is genuine oppression going on, where the government and the media recently did a shaming article, a magazine, I think it's called The Critic, where it openly named Edinburgh University academics to try and shame them by saying they're friends of or they're espousing terrorism and so forth. So there is a lot of fear at British universities at the moment, and at Edinburgh University as well, about the way that the government is now trying to clamp down on support for Gaza. And that is very frightening. And I know Hil talks brilliantly about UCU and about the British university and general university climate and the pressures that academics are under. So it is a very complex area, but I think the really scary stuff is happening from the right and from elites trying to silence academics when they're trying to speak out on behalf of disempowered groups. I don't know, Hil, if you've got anything to add to that in terms of universities.
Well, I can speak about this kind of idea that has been running through the entire discussion, I suppose, about like power in these conversations, because in my book I argue, I don't want to get too academic, but like that the BDS movement is a movement like from below, not only in the sense of it's mostly grassroots, but in that it's supporting subaltern, like marginalised, disenfranchised groups. And then on the other hand, the counter-BDS movement and the Zionist movement and its allies in the British state and whatnot is a sort of movement from above. I also see it as a social movement, but with the state of Israel at its heart. both mostly elite, although it does have grassroots elements, but supporting essentially a dominant, oppressive force, Israeli apartheid. And I use this quote from Colin Lees, who's a sort of socialist writer, and he spoke about how, like, for an ideology to be hegemonic, it doesn't necessarily need to be kind of loved and supported. And I'm thinking of like Zionism here and the crisis of Zionism that's been going on and contested since around the 1990s, if not before. It doesn't need to be loved. It needs to simply be the case that no other ideology can kind of like meaningfully take its place. And so that's how I understand censorship in the case of Palestine. Israel kidnapped and is detaining Ahed Tamimi. Earlier this week, she's a young Palestinian woman from the village of Nabi Salah in the West Bank. She became famous a few years ago for slapping an Israeli soldier after they shot her cousin. I visited Nabi Salah like 15 years ago or something when she was a kid. She's one of many children, Palestinian children, who grow up under military occupation. And she wrote in The Guardian, I agree, trash, but she did an interview with The Guardian a few years ago where she said, Israel is afraid of the truth. And I think that's I think that's true, because that's why they want to say, if we didn't have power, if words didn't have power, they wouldn't try to censor us. In the media, like this idea of like false equivalence is why we get this both sides thing from. And actually what's interesting and why it's cool to be speaking on a panel about Palestinian rights and trans rights together is that like there are some commonalities, and as Gina said, the kind of right wing actually completely flip the power dynamics. There's a good article if anyone wants to read something in Transgender Studies Quarterly by you've probably seen it maybe, Gina, by an article, a scholar called Heike Schotten, where she comes up with this phrase of extinction phobia, the idea that both the TERFs, the organized transphobic movement, and the Zionist movement have this almost like psychotic paranoia that like the people we're oppressing, they want to annihilate us. So it's completely flipping the power dynamic on its head. And as Gina alluded to, the fact that 500,000 people marched in London last week, there might be 1 million today on Palestine, and 1 million people marched against Iraq, and that didn't make a difference. It shows us very clearly that in the case of Palestine, it's very clear around the world, the people are with Palestine, and this is the kind of argument I make in my book. It's a small number of people with a lot of power who are maintaining Israeli apartheid, and it tells us something about the grossly unequal power relations of our society that allows this injustice to continue.
Yeah, and to determine who gets a voice and who gets a platform, yeah. We're going to put it out to the audience just now for some questions. So we have a microphone coming around. We're going to try and take 2 at a time, if possible. So please put your hand up if you've got a question just now.
I will also just remind everyone, because we've got another event coming up soon, if we keep our questions as brief and concise as possible, but there will also be other opportunities for you to talk and discuss after the event. So thank you very much. I'll start over here.
Hello, thanks Hil and Gina, lovely to see you. So mainstream media often vilifies minorities by pitting them against other marginalised groups. So with trans people it's women, with critics of Israel it's Jews. To what extent do we have a responsibility to account for and apologise for the bad actors on our side? So trans people who do utilise misogynistic tropes when they're pushing back, or pro-Palestinian voices that do enter the terrain of anti-Semitism? And if we do need to take responsibility for those voices, how do we prevent those issues from dominating the conversation?
Anyone else just now? We'll take that one. Hil?
Yeah, I think we all have a responsibility to challenge all oppressive speech and behaviour whenever it crops up. I think that for me, I'm opposed to Israeli apartheid because I'm an anti-racist, and so that's completely consistent with challenging anti-Semitism. And anyone who's been in the Palestine Solidarity movement knows that it does occasionally crop up on the fringes. I don't think we should pretend it doesn't. So that's pretty clear to me. I think that's all I have to say, really. Gina?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the kind of example that you might mean, though, in terms of trans people who might have said something problematic. Is that what you mean? And being called out? I mean, I guess it depends. If it's like misogyny, which can happen, if something tips over. So, for example, this was a trans ally. There was a, yeah, I can talk about this. I hope this person doesn't mind too much. But in a protest on the 26th of April this year, it was the second attempted screening of adult human female, which again it got stopped, partly due to direct action. There was we had a DJ who did make some joking comments about the age of some of the anti-trans protesters. And afterwards there were talks with the organizers of the protest generally saying that line was crossed. Like protests, like even making fun of anti-trans protesters, it depends what you're going to do, but like if you're going into misogyny and ridiculing people on terms of things like age, yeah, of course. Then you have conversations, you call people in. I would hope rather than just calling people out. The difference being not trying to publicly shame people for making mistakes necessarily, but just kind of educating and talking things through. There are other examples. Yeah, I mean, Caitlyn Jenner supporting Trump. I would be very happy to call that out. There are times when I do feel it's very frustrating so for example, if it's a trans woman who's been guilty of a horrendous crime, and then trans people are called upon to apologize, I feel like that kind of gets weaponized, and then I do kind of roll my eyes and think, it's almost like people from marginalized groups have to apologize when a single event, a single example is leapt upon and politicized. Then maybe I am a little bit more reluctant. It depends on the situation. In the situation I've just described of an activist, local activist situation, that involved an intervention. But if it's going to be someone on Twitter saying, do you denounce this person and this person or whatever, it's like, yeah, maybe I will and maybe I won't, because I think it's maybe coming from a position of bad faith where they're just trying to force that person from that vulnerable group to apologize on behalf of a community, which I think is unfair. So I think it depends.
Yeah, it seems that the balance between insisting upon accountability but not allowing that sort of right-wing refocusing of the narrative onto individual acts as opposed to the justice of the movement as a whole is a tricky thing to navigate. Any more questions from the audience just now?
Thank you both for such an amazing talk. I wanted to ask a question in relation to the safeguarding, especially in universities, of trans students and currently students of Palestinian descent. The reason why I ask is I also teach Edinburgh University. We've been told not to speak about Palestine in our history classes. There's been issues before where we've no-platformed very turfy academics, thinking when I was undergrad, a woman named Selena Todd, who was very transphobic. My issue comes back to when there are real tangible lives, trans students, students from Palestinian descent, the actual mental exhaustion and pain that they must go through, that their lives become an abstract theoretical notion. How do you deal with safeguarding those students in times of crisis like this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question, and it's almost a historical one. Because the example I gave in 1915, so the black and brown communities didn't just organize protests, they organized their own kind of counter spaces where black and brown people could gather and talk about all the horrific things that were happening. They also did historical lectures, they did shows, they did these very affirming kind of counter events. And that, in fact, that's one of the guidances from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is rather than go and protest in the US to Milo Yiannopoulos, do a counter event where people can come together and talk in a safe space. And Edinburgh University, we have done that. In fact, it happened certainly in December outside of Adult Human Female. There was a space organized just for trans and non-binary people to kind of gather and talk about, how upsetting it was. As just this kind of safe space. So those safe spaces often do get organized at the same time that something unpleasant is happening. And in fact, there's a third screening happening next week for Adult Human Female. And there's going to be a counter well, several counter events, in fact, and because it coincides with Trans Day of Remembrance, of course it does. There's this anti-trans film, so there'll be, for example, I'm doing a 20-minute lecture kind of speaking thing on trans poetics, talking about all this wonderful poetry that's been created by all these amazing trans poets. And a colleague of mine is going to talk about actually computer games, but like in relation to trans. So it's like, it's creating this counter-public space almost, where trans, non-binary and allies can get together and create a more affirming space. So that's one way of doing it, is just being very aware that we shouldn't have to expect trans and non-binary people, for example, to turn up to these protests, but having alternative spaces for them. I think that's really important when you're doing protests. So that would be one of my answers.
Sorry, this is just a collection of fragmented thoughts, but yeah, yesterday I got up at 4 a.m. I just want to mention this because I guess in relation to the thing I said at the beginning about like sometimes getting a bit academic and abstract. Yesterday I got up at 4 a.m. and with 400 trade unionists and workers, we blocked an arms factory in London, and like I know that Pal Action don't know that. So yeah, right. But I'm knackered, and then my train up to Scotland was delayed, so that's an excuse. But anyway, in relation to the, I guess, oh God, sorry, I'm like, I think what I wanted to say was that yeah, it's not a coincidence that the free speech absolutists are usually like cis-het white men, and the narrative, the idea that like Jewish students feel unsafe by Palestinian liberation is so depressing, and it's firstly kind of invisibilizing the fact that Palestinians are having bombs dropped on them, and that's what real safety is. And secondly, I think it's this like civilizational discourse that we've seen come out of the woodwork with especially Benjamin Netanyahu's tweets about like the children of light, and you know, essentially like this real kind of clash of civilizations, Samuel Huntington stuff, that like the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, they're terrorist, barbarian, anti-Semites, and I think I would, you know, call it like Zionist fragility in the same way as white fragility exists. And I mean, I suppose, like, as a trans person, also just speak to, like, the way that, like, I think Gina mentioned, you know, that there's, like, an epidemic of suicide in the trans community because of the way people, well, partly the state of the healthcare and the waiting list, but also the way that, like, words matter and people constantly being degraded and made to feel like there's something wrong with them, like, has a profound effect on your self-esteem and your kind of desire to live. So I think we do need to contest, in regard to your question, we do need to contest in these institutional spaces, like how we understand safeguarding, and like all the things we've been talking about, free speech, it's a contested concept, and how we apply it is very malleable. But as Gina said as well, I would agree, we need our own spaces, and we need to build our own safe spaces which reflect the values that we hold, which, you know, I would, you know, should be like against transphobia and against Zionism, and against all forms of racism.
Yeah, I think cases like that also give the lie to the idea that speech in itself cannot be a harmful act or a violent act, because, yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. We have time for one more audience question, if anyone has one. Oh.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been really interesting. I guess I want to go back to the point that, Hil, that you made about how we see, like, across the world, people being really mobilizing for Palestine, but there are these elites that hold this power that are clearly very Zionist. But also these are often elites that have a lot of very anti-Semitic sentiments. And I'm wondering what you think the benefits are for these people, for often government officials in the UK, in the US, in places in Europe, to be pro-Zionist whilst also holding anti-Semitic beliefs. And whether that's just to kind of create a power play between communities, or whether there's also other strategic thought behind that.
Yeah, I mean, this is quite a long-standing kind of phenomenon. So when Britain issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, that was in the interests of British imperialism. You know, Chaim Weizmann and the Zionist movement were lobbying for it, but the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, Edwin Montagu, opposed it. He felt it was anti-Semitic, it would make Jewish people feel unwelcome in Britain and other countries. But the Labour Party at the time was much more Zionist than the Tory Party, and as you say, had a long history of also anti-Semitism. So, I don't agree with the people who recently tried to say, like, Labour Party isn't anti-Semitic, because it has historically been the case. And we've seen the alliance between Israel and far right, including leaders who've said anti-Semitic stuff, whether that's Bolsonaro, Modi in India, Trump, Orban, the list could go on, show us time and time again that the interests of the Israeli state in Netanyahu and the far-right Israeli government side massively trump what's in the interest of the Jewish community in terms of fighting anti-Semitism. And then the flip side of that, we've seen really inspiring and beautiful examples of solidarity from Jewish community with Palestinians, especially in the US, with Jewish Voice of Peace, massive occupation of Grand Central Station, really puncturing that myth that somehow, Judaism and Zionism can be conflated, or Jewish interests and Jewish people can be conflated with Israel. But unfortunately, as we've been talking about, it's not enough to say, I think people know increasingly that this idea is a myth, and people have been saying that, and Palestinians have been saying that for a long time, and anti-Zionist Jews have as well. But the problem is we need to build the power to make it matter, because some of the main people I talk about in my book who are kind of active in the pro-Israel movement are not Jewish, they're Zionists. Like Luke Aked is one, he leads this group called We Believe in Israel. He's on the NEC of the Labour Party, and I'm rambling now, so I'll stop, but yeah, that makes sense.
Just borrowing these really important themes, because it's used across against social justice movements. In trans community, we've seen over the last few years, organizations like LGBT Alliance that are hostile to trans people, and they claim to be representative of the LGBT community, and they're not. When there was a recent YouGov poll, it was something like 96% of cis bi women support trans rights, and 94 or 95% of cis lesbians support trans women and their rights. So it's this these organizations. You had a word for it, but it's from the top, this kind of shadow civil kind of order of just organizations. The EHRC is probably the most perfect example of the government top down appointing these anti-trans seems generally quite, if not racist, they've denied the existence of structural racism. There are all kinds of complaints within these organizations that they are hostile to the very minorities that they're meant to protect. And so this is a general strategy that happens. It's been happening against the trans community. They're both targeting of legitimate charities like Stonewall, and then trying to support AstroTurf organizations like LGBT Alliance to kind of create wedge issues, to kind of divide social justice movements in order to confuse and blur and try and turn people against each other. This is a strategy, and we all have to kind of understand this in social justice movements and stand strong with each other and denounce these kind of shadow AstroTurf organizations at the same time. But yeah, it's a real playbook that you write about so well in your book, and we're all kind of, we all have to fight back against these kinds of organizations and these wedge issues, because it is very strategic. And newspapers that claim trans women are a threat to women's rights, these are the same newspapers like the Times that when women lost the right to abortion after the repeal of Roe versus Wade, I remember the Times front page, the editorial position, saying, this is a good thing that happened, that Roe versus Wade was repealed. This will lead to blah, blah, blah. It was some kind of technocratic answer. A newspaper that spent 5 years saying trans women are a threat to women suddenly was saying, isn't it good that women have lost their rights in the USA? So there's so much hypocrisy. These are wedge issues. These are all strategies to divide people, and we have to remember that.
Can I just add very quickly that, I do talk in the book about the number of grassroots or AstroTurf organizations, like fake grassroots almost organizations that the Israeli embassy has helped to create in this country. And what that tells us is, A, there isn't a load of popular, spontaneous support for Israeli apartheid and genocide at all. And B, that our voices do matter, and they are worried. On the mailing list of lots of pro-Israel organizations, and they are very worried about, hundreds of thousands of us on the streets and lobbying our MPs and speaking up for Palestine. So we do have power, not as much, but collectively we do have power, and we need to keep speaking out and not self-censor and not be afraid, because I feel like there is a narrative shift happening, unprecedented brutality in Palestine, but unprecedented solidarity coming up from the grassroots as well. So that, you know, that gives me a lot of hope, and so I'm looking forward to like going to the demo with everyone after this.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think that's a pretty good point to end on. So we will call it there. But as I say, many of us, and I'm sure many of you, will be going to the demo on Waverley Bridge, so we'll be heading along there shortly. Please join me in thanking our two fantastic speakers for this event.
It's really difficult to walk. I didn't dress properly for that because I didn't know there was going to be a protest, and now, okay, I will be there.